10 attacks on American forces during a ceasefire. Say that number out loud and then say the word ceasefire again and notice how those two things cannot exist in the same sentence with any logical coherence, 10 times, not once in a moment of confusion. Not twice in an escalating sequence that both sides acknowledged and stepped back from, 10 separate attacks on United States military forces during a period that the American government is officially describing as a ceasefire and that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is simultaneously describing as the framework within which project. Freedom and diplomatic negotiations are operating. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirmed that number at a Pentagon briefing, 10 attacks on US forces during the ceasefire. 9 commercial ships fired upon during the ceasefire, 2 container ships seized during the ceasefire, and his assessment of what all of that means for the status of the ceasefire itself was the sentence that should have stopped every analyst covering this conflict cold. He said it is all below the threshold of restarting major combat. Operations at this point, below the threshold, 10 attacks on American forces is below the threshold. Which means the question that the coverage of Project Freedom and the diplomatic back channel and the Axios deal reports has been treating as the central strategic question of this conflict, whether the ceasefire will hold, is not actually the central strategic question. The central strategic question is what the threshold actually is, who decides when it has been crossed, and whether the IRGC systematic below-threshold harassment strategy, 10 attacks here, 9 commercial ships there, 2 container ships seized, way hit with 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, and 4 drones in a single day, is being designed specifically to stay below whatever that threshold is while extracting maximum operational benefit from the ceasefire window the threshold creates. Because if that is the IRGC strategy, and the evidence of the last several days makes a compelling case that it is, then the ceasefire is not a pause in the conflict. It is a one-sided operational environment in which one party shoots at everything and the other party counts attacks and updates its threshold assessment. That is not a ceasefire, that is a target range with American ships as the targets. Let me reconstruct the operational picture of the last 24 hours with the precision it demands, because the specific sequence of events matters enormously for understanding the strategic logic underneath what appears on the surface to be chaotic and contradictory decision-making. 2 American destroyers, the USS Truxtun and USS Mason, entered the Strait of Hormuz yesterday under conditions that the CBS News account described with a specificity that most coverage has not fully transmitted to its audience. They did not transit a contested waterway and encounter occasional harassment. They navigated through an Iranian minefield. While navigating that minefield, they faced a sustained barrage, that is the specific language used by American military officials, of coordinated threats from multiple simultaneous vectors, small boats approaching from the water, missiles launched from Iranian positions, drones deployed to complicate the defensive picture. All of it happening simultaneously in a waterway that is narrow, that has only one way in and one way out, and that Iran has been mining for months with the specific intention of making exactly this kind of transit as dangerous as possible for exactly these kinds of vessels. The crews of those destroyers were not watching one threat at a time. They were managing a simultaneous engagement requirement against mines in the water, fast attack boats on the surface, missiles in the air, and drones designed to complicate the radar picture that the missile defense systems depend on. That is the operational environment that 2 destroyer crews navigated yesterday, and they navigated it successfully. Neither vessel was struck. No projectile reached the ships. The Apache helicopters supporting the transit destroyed between 6 and a Turg fast attack boats. 2 American-flagged commercial vessels that had been stranded in the Persian Gulf were extracted and brought through the strait to safety. On the pure operational ledger of what the transit set out to achieve, it achieved it. The question that the operational success does not answer is whether what was demonstrated in the strait yesterday constitutes meaningful progress toward any of the strategic objectives that this conflict was initiated to achieve. Now let me show you the geography of this in the way it needs to be shown, because understanding the physical terrain the destroyers moved through is essential for understanding why what they did yesterday was as significant as it was and why the claim that Iran does not control the strait requires more precision than it has been receiving. Pull up a map of the region and the picture is immediately legible. Iran sits along the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf itself is essentially a landlocked body of water. The only exit, the only way anything gets in or out, is through the Strait of Hormuz at its southeastern end. That strait is narrow at its tightest point. It is approximately 34 kilometers wide with navigable shipping lanes significantly more constrained than that. Iran's coastline lines the northern side of that choke point. Its fast attack boat bases, its missile batteries, its drone launch infrastructure, its mine-laying operations, all of it is positioned along that northern shore with direct access to the waterway that 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply traveled through before this conflict began. The American blockade is not in the strait. It is positioned further east, generally off the eastern coast of Oman extending north toward Iran. The reason for that positioning is not strategic choice in the sense of preferring that location. It is operational necessity. Iran has been firing missiles and drones at American naval vessels since the war began, sitting ships inside the strait's narrow confines, within the effective range of every Iranian coastal weapon system simultaneously. Is not a blockade posture. It is a target presentation, Until yesterday, the American naval posture kept its assets in the relatively more survivable waters east of the strait where they could maintain the blockade function without presenting themselves as stationary targets in a shooting gallery. What the Truxtun and Mason did yesterday was go into the shooting gallery, on purpose, with Apache support, and come out the other side with 2 American commercial vessels that had been stranded for weeks. That took something. And whatever the strategic debates about Project Freedom's scope and duration and coalition support, that specific act deserves the recognition of what it actually was. The Iranian media response to the transit tells you as much about the IRG's current information strategy as it does about what actually happened. In the Strait, Iranian media initially reported that it had hit 2 American Navy vessels. That claim evolved over the course of the day into a claim that Iranian forces had fired at the destroyers and forced them to turn around. Neither of those claims is consistent with what CENTCOM confirmed and what subsequent reporting established. The ships made it through. No projectiles reached them. 2 American commercial vessels were extracted. What Iranian media was doing in its evolving account of the engagement is a specific and well-documented information warfare pattern. Claim success immediately when an engagement occurs. When the success claim becomes unsustainable as contradicting evidence emerges, modify the claim to something less falsifiable, force them to turn around, cause them to alter their course. Demonstrated that the waterway is contested, the goal is not accuracy. The goal is to ensure that the domestic Iranian audience, operating in a country where 99% of the population has no internet access and state media is the primary information source, receives a version of events in which the IRG is not defeated. The American destroyers that successfully transited the strait under fire and extracted stranded commercial vessels are described to Iranian audiences as ships that were fired on and forced to retreat. The fast attack boats that were destroyed by Apache helicopters are described as civilian cargo vessels attacked without provocation. The information environment that the internet shutdown has created inside Iran is the operational space in which the IRG's propaganda architecture functions. And it functions because the Iranian public has no independent means of verifying what actually happened in the strait yesterday. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's declaration that Operation Epic Fury is over deserves the specific analytical attention it has not been receiving from coverage treating it as a routine administrative update. He said it plainly at the podium. Operation Epic Fury is over. That is old news. We are moving on to Project Freedom. And the timing of that declaration is the detail that makes it more complex than its surface statement suggests. The 60-day mark under the War Powers Resolution, the point at which congressional authorization is required for continued military operations or withdrawal must begin, was the operational deadline that the Epic Fury declaration addresses. By formally notifying Congress that Operation Epic Fury is complete, the administration resets the legal clock. The 60-day timer that was approaching its limit starts over with whatever the new operational designation is. Project Freedom. This is not a semantic game in the dismissive sense that the word semantics is sometimes used to suggest trivial word choices. It is a constitutional mechanism being managed with specific legal and operational intent. The question it raises is one that the Atlantic Council assessment that was referenced in the source material articulates with unusual clarity for a think tank publication. What is the actual strategic objective that the new operation is designed to advance? Because Project Freedom as described is a freedom of navigation operation. Freedom of navigation is a means, it is not an end. The end, the thing that this conflict was initiated to achieve, is the permanent elimination of the IRG's nuclear program and proxy financing capability, and the relationship between opening commercial shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz and achieving the permanent elimination of those capabilities is not a direct or obvious one. It is at best step one of a much longer sequence whose subsequent steps have not been publicly articulated in a way that makes the sequence legible as a coherent strategy. The Atlantic Council assessment that was referenced deserves direct engagement because it identifies the central strategic contradiction of the American position. With a precision that the official communications have been carefully designed to avoid stating, the assessment identifies what it calls a strategic gray zone. The administration's rhetoric implies ambitions that resemble regime change. In practice, it is neither willing nor able to pursue the kind of sustained large-scale military and political effort that such a goal would require. As a result, policy falls into a strategic gray zone, applying pressure without a clear end state. That assessment tracks against the observable record of this conflict in ways that are uncomfortable but accurate. The regime has been changed in the sense that the supreme leader who led it for decades was killed in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury and was replaced by his son in a process that 8 members of the constitutionally responsible selecting body described as coercive. The IRG has effectively overthrown civilian governance and is running the country as a junta behind the institutional clothing of the Islamic Republic. The civilian president did not know about attacks his own military was conducting. The foreign minister executes org orders rather than presidential instructions. The proxy network that was the IRG's primary instrument of regional power projection has been defunded by the blockade and is dissolving as the financial flows from Tehran dry up. In every meaningful functional sense, the regime has been changed. But the organization that produced the nuclear program, the proxy network, the Hormuz closure doctrine, the institutional culture of revolutionary maximalism that has driven every Iranian strategic decision since 1979, that organization is still there, degraded, fractured under maximum financial and military pressure, but still there, still shooting at commercial ships, still firing 12 ballistic missiles at the way in a single day, still launching the Persian Gulf Strait Authority website to institutionalize its claim to control the waterway, and still 10 times attacking American forces during a ceasefire. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority is the operational detail of the last 24 hours that has received the least attention and deserves the most. Iran has launched a formal website. An email address has been published. The mechanism through which shipping companies are expected to coordinate with the IRG and obtain authorization for passage through the Strait of Hormuz has been made public and institutional. This is not a military capability. It does not add a single operational asset to the IRG's degraded naval force. What it does is attempt to transform the IRG's de facto claim to Hormuz control into a de jure institutional fact. Every shipping company that accesses that website, every vessel operator that contacts the IRG email address to inquire about passage procedures, every payment that is made in whatever form is eventually requested for transit clearance provides the IRG with both revenue that the blockade is supposed to be denying and with a form of recognized authority over a waterway that Project Freedom is simultaneously claiming can be transited under American protection without IRG permission. The two claims are in direct contradiction. Project Freedom says American naval power can escort vessels through the strait without IRG authorization. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority says any safe passage must be coordinated with the IRG under all circumstances. The strait cannot simultaneously be a waterway where American escorts provide sufficient safety assurance and a waterway where IRG authorization is the governing mechanism for passage. One of those claims has to be operationally validated before the other becomes irrelevant. And the relevant question for the next several days is which validation comes first. Either Project Freedom demonstrates through sustained commercial transit that the American escort framework works reliably and the IRG's claims become meaningless, or the IRG's sustained harassment campaign demonstrates that the cost of transiting without its permission is unacceptable and the Persian Gulf Strait Authority becomes the de facto governing mechanism regardless of what American officials say at Pentagon briefings. The coalition question is where Project Freedom's long-term viability becomes genuinely uncertain, and the honest assessment of where things stand on this dimension requires acknowledging something uncomfortable about the operational record of the last 24 hours. 2 American destroyers successfully transited the strait under a sustained barrage that is a genuine operational achievement. It is also a demonstration of what the transit costs. And what it costs is the kind of operational intensity that commercial shipping companies and their insurers are not going to look at and decide constitutes an acceptable framework for regular commercial operations. The volume of fire that the Truxtun and Mason faced, mines in the water, fast attack boats on the surface, missiles in the air, drones complicating the defensive picture simultaneously, is not a risk profile that maritime insurance actuaries are going to price as manageable for routine commercial transit. The 2 American commercial vessels that were extracted are out. The thousands of vessels that remain stranded in and around the Persian Gulf, and the thousands more that would need to transit to restore anything approaching normal commercial flow through the waterway, are still facing the same environment that made 2 destroyers. With Apache support and every defensive system available to the United States Navy necessary for a single transit operation. The South Korean National Security Advisor confirmed that his country was reviewing joining Project Freedom until the project was suspended before South Korean ships could have physically reached the theater. Germany's chancellor noted that communication before entering a war would be helpful. The multilateral coalition that Project Freedom implied when it was announced with a CENTCOM commander at a podium and invitations extended to South Korea to come and join the mission has not materialized. The U.S. Navy is running this operation with itself. And 2 destroyers and Apache support extracting 2 commercial vessels at a time is not a mechanism for restoring the commercial flow through a waterway that 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply depends on. Rubio's comment about the nuclear material buried deep is the most operationally significant statement from the American diplomatic side in the last 24 hours, and it has been almost entirely overshadowed by the Project Freedom suspension and resumption drama. He said the negotiation must address not just the enrichment question but what happens to the material that is buried deep somewhere, that Iran still has access to if it ever wanted to dig it out, that has to be addressed and is being addressed in the negotiation. He declined to go further on what progress has been made because he did not want to endanger the negotiations. Read what is embedded in that statement. The United States is demanding that Iran account for and surrender enriched uranium material that survived the strikes on its nuclear facilities and that is now located in underground storage whose precise configuration the American side apparently does not have complete visibility into. Iran has highly enriched uranium enriched to 60% that was not destroyed in the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury. The location of that material, the amount of it, and the mechanism for verifying its disposition under any agreement is the central technical question on which the nuclear dimension of any deal depends, and Rubio's statement that it has to be addressed and is being addressed suggests that this question is active in the negotiations. even as the public communications about Project Freedom and the ceasefire threshold and the Axios deal reports consume the available coverage bandwidth. The buried material is the thing that makes the nuclear question irreducible to any formulation that does not include verified physical disposition. You can agree to a moratorium on enrichment. You can agree to halt the nuclear program. You can agree to allow inspections of declared facilities. None of those agreements addresses what happens to the material that is already enriched and is already buried. And that material, in the hands of an organization that has spent decades pursuing nuclear capability and that has explicitly stated it views the program as the last justification for its institutional existence, is the variable. That makes every other element of a potential agreement contingent on something that is harder to verify than any of the operational commitments that the negotiating framework is built around. The financial clock continues running beneath all of this operational and diplomatic activity with the indifference of a physical process that does not pause for ceasefire thresholds or Project Freedom suspensions or Truth Social posts. Iran is losing approximately $240 million per day in direct oil export revenue from the naval blockade that both Trump's statement and Cooper's briefing confirmed remains in full force and effect. The IMF has Iran's economy contracting at 6.1% in 2026 with inflation running at 68.9%. The rial has reached approximately 1.32 million per US dollar. The 2-week window before Karg Island's storage tanks reach physical capacity and the geological clock starts running on permanent oil field damage has advanced by the number of days that have passed since Trump described it with technical specificity. It is now a shorter window, the physics of pressurized oil storage and reservoir pressure dynamics do not pause for any of the above. They run, and when the ceiling is reached, the consequence is structural and irreversible regardless of what the ceasefire threshold assessment says or what the Axios deal reporting describes as close to completion. The IRG launching attacks on commercial shipping and the way while this clock runs, choosing harassment operations that it has calibrated to stay below the American threshold for major combat operations, reflects one of two possible calculations. Either the IRG believes it can exhaust American patience and extract a deal that preserves its nuclear program and Hormuz leverage before the geological clock produces the permanent damage, or the IRG has concluded that the institutional cost of a deal that strips those capabilities exceeds the economic cost of the permanent oil field damage and has decided to run out the clock on its own survival prospects rather than accept the concessions that would allow a deal. Both calculations are dangerous. The second one is catastrophic. General Kane's 10 attack statement is the data point that cuts through every other analytical framework currently being applied to this conflict and demands a direct response that the threshold language has been carefully constructed to defer 10 attacks on American forces during a ceasefire. The threshold language says this is below the level that restarts major combat operations. The strategic gray zone assessment says the administration is applying pressure without a clear end state. The Atlantic Council analysis says trying to demand regime change level concessions while negotiating with the same regime is inherently contradictory. All of those assessments are accurate, and all of them circle around the same question without landing on it directly. What happens at 11? What is the attack that crosses the threshold? Is it a projectile that actually reaches an American ship rather than being intercepted? Is it a casualty rather than a near miss? Is it a strike on a specific type of asset that the threshold definition treats differently from the destroyers and commercial vessels that have already been targeted? Because the IRG's below-threshold harassment strategy works only as long as the threshold is defined clearly enough that the IRG can calibrate its attacks to stay beneath it. If the threshold is shifting, if it is defined by escalating counts rather than specific types of attacks, then the IRG's calibration problem becomes more difficult with each incident. But if the threshold is fixed and the IRG has correctly identified its location, then 10 attacks is simply the number below the fixed line and 11 attacks is the one that the IRG's planners have decided they do not want to reach. In that case, the harassment strategy is not reckless. It is precisely calibrated, and the ceasefire is not a pause in hostilities. It is a framework that one side is exploiting and the other side is managing Project Freedom's future, and by extension the entire framework of American strategy in the next phase of this conflict depends on resolving the question that the Atlantic Council assessment identified as the central strategic decision that has not been made. Is the objective freedom of navigation, nuclear constraints, or regime change? Because these three objectives require fundamentally different instruments applied at different scales over different timescales and they are not simultaneously achievable through the current posture. Freedom of navigation requires sustained naval presence that can escort commercial vessels through a contested waterway at a pace and scale that actually restores commercial flow rather than extracting 2 vessels at a time under sustained barrage. It requires either a coalition that no allied government has yet committed to joining, or a unilateral American commitment to indefinite naval operations in the world's most contested shipping lane. Nuclear constraints require a verified agreement with a government that can actually deliver on its commitments, which the current Iranian governmental structure, with the IRG running operations without telling the president and the foreign minister executing military orders rather than presidential instructions, demonstrably cannot. 2. And regime change, the objective that the rhetoric implies but the official communications refuse to name, requires exactly what Rubio's predecessor at the State Department's level of ambition would require. A long, costly campaign potentially involving sustained conflict measured in months or years, with a plan for what comes after the regime that no one appears to have developed in the kind of detail that actual post-conflict governance requires, trying to achieve all three simultaneously through a posture calibrated to stay below the threshold for major combat operations while negotiating through a government that cannot deliver on what it agrees to achieves none of them. It achieves the strategic gray zone, pressure without end state, activity without objective. Ships extracted two at a time under sustained barrage from a waterway that is not open and will not be open until one of those three objectives is clearly chosen and the instruments required to achieve it are deployed at the scale that achieving it actually requires. Here is where everything converges into the picture that May 5th, 2026 has produced for anyone willing to look at all of it simultaneously rather than at each piece in isolation. The USS Truxtun and USS Mason went into the shooting gallery and came out successfully with two commercial vessels. That happened and it matters. The Apache helicopters turned 6 Irg fast attack boats into submarines. That happened and it matters. 10 attacks on American forces during the ceasefire below the threshold for major combat operations. That happened and it matters in a different way. 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, and 4 drones fired at the way in a single day, resulting in 3 moderate injuries. That happened and it matters. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority website launched to institutionalize Zerg control of the waterway while Project Freedom claims to be reopening it. That happened and it matters. Rubio declaring Operation Epic Fury over while the war powers clock reset and the next legal window open for whatever comes after Project Freedom. That happened and it matters. Iran still shooting at everything. One more commercial vessel hit with fire on board just before recording began. The strategic gray zone producing pressure without end state. The threshold holding at 10 while 11 stays uncrossed. And somewhere in the back channels that the Axios reports keep describing as close to a breakthrough and that Iranian state media keeps describing as containing unacceptable clauses, a negotiation with a government that cannot deliver on what it negotiates because the organization that controls the guns is not in the room and has not authorized anyone in the room to make the concessions that the American position requires. 2 destroyers forced the strait yesterday. That is real. Opening the strait to the actual flow of commerce is a different thing entirely. And the distance between those two things, between what happened in the last 24 hours and what needs to happen before any of the 3 strategic objectives is achieved, is the distance that 10 weeks and 10 attacks on American forces during a ceasefire have not yet closed. Drop your analysis in the comments right now. Because the central question this conflict has been building toward, what exactly is the objective and what is the sequence that gets there, has not been answered in 10 weeks of operations, 8 claimed deal breakthroughs, 1 formal declaration that one phase is over, and 10 attacks on American forces below the threshold for the next phase to begin. The next few days will either produce the clarity that the strategic gray zone assessment says is necessary, or they will produce the escalation that the below threshold calibration strategy is designed to eventually trigger. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the threshold gets defined by what crosses it rather than by what is below it, what follows will move faster than any daily news cycle can track, and we will be here for every moment of it.